The remembrance drifted through the void like a dying whale, its hull scarred by decades of service and patched with mismatched metal plates that told stories of 1,000 battles. To the Korthek raiders watching from their sleek interceptors, it looked like easy prey, a human transport vessel, alone and vulnerable in the dark between stars. Captain Thekvar studied the readings on his tactical display, his chitinous fingers drumming against the console. The ship registered minimal energy signatures, basic life support, and what appeared to be a crew of perhaps 30 humans. Ancient technology, outdated weapon systems, and from the thermal scans, most of the crew seemed to be in their twilight years. "Perfect. Signal the fleet," he commanded, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never truly faced human desperation. "We have found our prize." The Korthek Empire had been expanding aggressively through this sector, claiming worlds and resources with little resistance from the scattered human colonies. Their intelligence suggested that Earth's military was spread thin, focused on conflicts in the Outer Rim. A lone transport vessel would yield valuable intelligence about human trade routes, defensive positions, and perhaps even military codes. On the bridge of the Remembrance, Captain Sarah Chen watched the approaching ships with eyes that had seen too much. At 73, her hair was silver white, but her gaze remained sharp as a blade. Around her, the bridge crew moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to waste no motion, no word, no breath in the service of survival. "Korthek design," reported Lieutenant Marcus Webb, his weathered hand steady on the sensor console despite the tremor that age had given them. 5 interceptors, closing fast. They are powering weapons. Chen nodded slowly. She had hoped for a few more peaceful years, had thought that perhaps the galaxy might let old soldiers fade quietly into the night. The Remembrance was supposed to be exactly what it appeared, a retirement cruise for veterans of the Terran war machine, a chance to visit distant worlds and share stories of battles fought and friends lost. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. "Communications," she said quietly. "Open a channel." The view screen flickered to life, revealing Captain Thekvar's alien features. The Korthek leader's 4 eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction as he took in the elderly human before him. "Human vessel," he began, his translator rendering his words in perfect standard. "You will surrender immediately. Prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in the destruction of your ship and the death of your crew." Chen studied the alien captain for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the bridge crew straighten unconsciously. "I am Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran vessel Remembrance. You are addressing veterans of the Terran war machine. I'm going to give you one chance to reconsider your course of action." Thekvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. "Threats from the elderly? How quaint. You have 60 seconds to comply." The channel closed, leaving the bridge in silence. Chen turned to her crew, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from their faces. These were people who had stood against the void when the galaxy burned, who had held a line when hope itself seemed lost. "All hands," Chen announced over the ship's communication system. "This is the captain. We are about to be boarded by hostile forces. I know we all hoped our fighting days were behind us, but it seems the universe has one more test for us." Throughout the ship, old soldiers straightened in their quarters, hands reaching for weapons they had hoped never to touch again. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Rosa Martinez ran her fingers along the hidden panels that concealed the Remembrance's true nature. In the medical bay, Dr. James Harrison began preparing for casualties while his hands automatically checked the locations of the combat stimulants he had sworn never to use again. "They think we're harmless," Chen continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the ship. "They see old humans and assume we're weak. They're about to learn the difference between veterans and victims." The first Korthek boarding pod struck the hull with a resounding clang, followed by 4 more in rapid succession. Cutting torches began their work, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled the corridors. Chen stood from her captain's chair, her hand moving to the weapon at her side, a plasma pistol that had seen action in 17 campaigns. "Remember," she said to her bridge crew, "we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every human ship that comes after us. We're fighting to ensure that this is the last time anyone makes the mistake of underestimating us." The cutting torches finished their work, and the first Korthek warriors began pouring through the breaches. They moved with the confidence of predators entering a sheep pen, expecting easy prey and quick victory. They were about to discover that sometimes the sheep had teeth. The first wave of Korthak warriors found the corridors of the Remembrance eerily quiet. Their thermal sensors showed human life signs scattered throughout the ship, but the expected panic screaming and desperate pleas for mercy were absent. Instead, there was only silence, the kind of silence that made experienced soldiers nervous. Squad leader Vex Taylor led his unit through the primary corridor, his weapon raised and ready. The human ship's interior was utilitarian, with worn metal walls and flickering lighting that spoke of age and long service. Perfect for an ambush, a small part of his mind noted, but he dismissed the thought. These were old humans, not warriors. The first indication that something was wrong came when they found the mess hall. Tables had been overturned to create defensive positions, and the lighting had been systematically destroyed to create pockets of shadow. Vex Taylor raised his hand to halt his squad, but it was already too late. The plasma bolt took him in the center of his chest, the superheated energy burning through his armor like it was paper. As he fell, the shadows around the room came alive with muzzle flashes and the distinctive whine of human energy weapons. Sergeant Rita Kowalski, formerly of the 15th Terran Shock Division, adjusted her position behind an overturned table and acquired her next target. At 68, her aim was as steady as it had been during the siege of Proxima Station, and her knowledge of close-quarters combat had only deepened with experience. "Contact front," she reported over the comm system, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around her. 5 hostiles down, more incoming. Throughout the ship, similar scenes played out as the Korthak boarding parties discovered that the Remembrance was anything but defenseless. What had appeared to be a simple transport vessel was revealing itself to be a floating fortress crewed by some of the most dangerous humans in the galaxy. In engineering, Chief Martinez had sealed the blast doors and was methodically picking off intruders with a modified plasma rifle. The Korthaks had expected to find frightened civilians. Instead, they found a woman who had held off 3 separate boarding actions during the Battle of Kepler's Ridge. "Engine room secure," she reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a particularly interesting technical problem. "Hostiles neutralized." The Korthak's initial confidence began to crumble as casualty reports flooded their communication channels. Squad after squad reported heavy resistance, impossible accuracy from the human defenders, and casualties mounting at an alarming rate. Captain Thekvar watched the tactical display with growing alarm. His boarding parties were being systematically destroyed, not by prepared military force, but by what his intelligence had described as helpless civilians. The humans were fighting with a precision and ruthlessness that spoke of extensive combat experience. "All units, fall back and regroup," he ordered, his voice betraying none of the fear that was beginning to creep into his thoughts. "Prepare for second-wave deployment." But even as he gave the order, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. The thermal readings were shifting, showing human life signs moving through the ship with purpose and coordination. These weren't civilians fleeing in panic. They were soldiers executing a defensive plan. On the bridge of the Remembrance, Captain Chen monitored the battle with the cool professionalism of someone who had commanded ships through the darkest days of the Terran War. The initial assault had been repelled, but she knew this was only the beginning. "Damage report," she requested. "Hull breaches sealed," reported Lieutenant Webb. "Casualty count, 0 friendly, 37 hostile." Chen nodded grimly. The Korthaks had walked into a trap of their own making, but she knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next wave will be different, more cautious, more prepared. "Communications," she ordered, "open a channel to the Korthak fleet." Thekvar's image appeared on the screen, his 4 eyes now showing something that hadn't been there before: uncertainty. "Captain," Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall, "you've made a serious error in judgment. You attacked a ship carrying veterans of the Terran war machine. We've spent our lives fighting enemies far more dangerous than your empire has ever faced." The Korthak captain's mandibles clicked nervously. "You are still outnumbered. Surrender now, and we will show mercy." Chen's smile was cold as winter on a dead world. "Mercy? You don't understand what you've done. You haven't just attacked a ship. You attacked the living history of human military doctrine. Every person on this vessel has fought in campaigns that would make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams." She gestured to the tactical display behind her, where the positions of the Korthak fleet were clearly marked. We could have lived out our remaining years in peace, sharing stories and tending gardens. Instead, you've chosen to remind us why we were never allowed to truly retire. The channel closed, leaving Thekvar staring at an empty screen. For the first time since the attack began, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest, genuine fear. On the Remembrance, the veterans prepared for the next assault with the methodical precision of people who had spent their lives perfecting the art of war. But something had changed in the ship's atmosphere. The resignation that had marked their retirement was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, the awakening of warriors who had thought their war was over. The second wave of Korthak attackers approached the Remembrance with significantly more caution. Captain Thekvar had learned from the devastating failure of his first assault, deploying heavier armor, more sophisticated weapons, and tactical specialists trained in shipboard combat. This time, he told himself, things would be different. They weren't. The veterans of the Remembrance had used the brief respite to transform their ship into something that defied easy classification. It was no longer simply a transport vessel. It had become a testament to decades of accumulated military knowledge, a floating demonstration of what happened when the galaxy's most experienced soldiers decided to fight one last time. Master Sergeant Carlos Vega, formerly of the 3rd Terra Marine Division, crouched behind a barricade he had constructed from furniture and bulkhead panels. At 7-1, his movements were slower than they had been during the Titan campaign, but his tactical awareness had only sharpened with age. He watched the Korthak assault team advance through the corridor, noting their formation, their weapon placement, their communication patterns. "They are learning," he muttered into his comm unit. "Professional soldiers this time, not raiders." The response came from Commander Elena Vasquez, who had once held the line at the Battle of Wolf's Gate. "Good. It's been too long since we faced a real challenge." The Korthaks had learned to expect resistance, but they hadn't learned to expect the kind of resistance that came from people who had spent their entire adult lives studying the art of war. The veterans didn't just fight. They fought with the accumulated wisdom of campaigns across a dozen star systems, with tactics refined through decades of conflict. When the Korthak assault team reached the barricade, they found it empty. The humans had withdrawn, leaving behind what appeared to be an abandoned defensive position. The alien soldiers advanced cautiously, scanning for traps or hidden enemies. The attack came from above, below, and behind simultaneously. Vega and his team had used the ship's maintenance tunnels and access shaft to create a three-dimensional battlefield that turned the Korthak numerical advantage into a liability. In the confined space of the ship's corridors, their greater numbers became a hindrance, while the human superior knowledge of the terrain became a decisive advantage. "This is impossible," Thekvar muttered, watching his tactical display show another squad disappearing into the ship's interior. "They are just civilians." His tactical officer, a young Korthak named Feldar, turned from his console with confusion written across his features. "So, I'm reading energy signatures from the human ship that don't match our intelligence reports. There are weapon systems powering up throughout the vessel." Thekvar's blood ran cold. "What kind of weapon systems?" "Unknown, sir. But the energy readings are significant." On the bridge of the Remembrance, Captain Chen watched the battle unfold with the calm satisfaction of someone who had seen similar scenes play out many times before. The Korthaks were learning, but they were learning too late. "Chief Martinez," she called to engineering. "Are you ready?" The response came immediately, tinged with something that might have been anticipation. "The old girl's been sleeping for 20 years, Captain, but she remembers how to fight." Chen nodded and turned to her weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Serakim, whose service record included actions at the siege of Centauri Prime and the liberation of the outer colonies. "Weapons free, Commander. Show them what they're really dealing with." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Hull plates slid aside to reveal weapon emplacements that had been hidden for decades. Point defense systems emerged from concealed positions, and the ship's power signature spiked as systems that had been dormant for 20 years suddenly roared to life. The Remembrance had never been simply a transport vessel. It had been built during the darkest days of the Terran War as a Q-ship, a vessel disguised as a harmless merchant transport but armed and crewed for war. When the veterans had requested it as their retirement cruise ship, the Terran Defense Force had agreed. thinking its war days were over. They had been wrong. The first salvo from the Remembrance caught the Korthak interceptors completely by surprise. These weren't the light defensive weapons they had expected from a civilian vessel. These were military-grade particle beams and plasma cannons, operated by people who had spent decades learning to use them effectively. The lead Korthak interceptor simply ceased to exist, vaporized by a concentrated beam that would have done credit to a main battle cruiser. The second ship managed to raise its shields, but the humans had been fighting against energy shielding for longer than the Korthak Empire had existed as a star-faring civilization. Modulating frequency, reported Commander Kim, her fingers dancing across controls she had thought she would never touch again. Firing. The second interceptor's shield collapsed under the precisely calibrated assault, and the ship itself followed moments later. Captain Thekvar watched his fleet being systematically destroyed by what he had thought was a helpless transport vessel. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were demonstrating a level of tactical and technological sophistication that made his own forces look primitive by comparison. Signal the fleet, he ordered desperately. Full retreat. All ships, full retreat. But it was too late. The veterans of the Remembrance had been reminded of something they had tried to forget. They were very, very good at war. And now, someone had made the mistake of reminding them why that mattered. The surviving Korthak ships fled into hyperspace, carrying with them news that would shake the foundations of their empire. Captain Thekvar, his fleet reduced to a single damaged cruiser, transmitted a desperate message to the Korthak High Command. The humans were not what they seemed. But on the Remembrance, the real war was just beginning. Captain Chen stood in the ship's communications center, surrounded by equipment that had been installed decades ago but never used. The message arrays and quantum transmitters had been dormant for 20 years, waiting for a day that everyone hoped would never come. "Are you certain about this?" asked Dr. Harrison, his medical officer's instinct warring with his soldier's training. "Once we send this message, there's no going back." Chen's expression was grim. "They attacked a ship carrying veterans of the Terran war machine. They've seen our capabilities, our tactics, our weapons. That intelligence is already on its way to their command structure." She activated the communication array, and across the galaxy, receivers that had been silent for decades suddenly came to life. The message was simple, transmitted on frequencies that only one group of people would recognize. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Remembrance. Protocol 7 is now in effect. The wolf is awake." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across human space, men and women who had spent their retirement years trying to forget the art of war suddenly remembered why they had been the galaxy's most feared military force. On farming worlds and mining stations, in orbital habitats and research facilities, the veterans of the Terran war machine began to move. Admiral Marcus Reed, officially retired for 15 years, stood in the garden of his home on New Geneva as the message reached him. At 8:02, he had thought his war days were over. He had been wrong. "Martha," he called to his wife, who was tending to roses that had been genetically modified to grow in the planet's unique soil. "I have to go." She turned, and in her eyes he saw the same understanding that had sustained their marriage through 40 years of service. "How long?" "I don't know. Maybe forever." Within hours, the galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence networks began reporting strange movements throughout human space. Ships that had been decommissioned were suddenly registering power signatures. Weapons that had been mothballed were being brought online. And most disturbing of all, personnel who had been marked as retired were disappearing from their peaceful lives. The Korthak Empire's High Command received Thekvar's report with skepticism that quickly turned to alarm. An attack on a single human transport vessel had somehow triggered a response that their intelligence networks couldn't fully comprehend. But the signs were unmistakable. Something was stirring in human space, something that had been sleeping for decades. "How many humans are we talking about?" asked Supreme Commander Vactoral, his four eyes studying the intelligence reports with growing concern. "Unknown, sir," replied Intelligence Director Zexmeron. "Our estimate suggests that the human military has been systematically understating their veteran population for decades. The soldiers we thought were dead or retired appear to be elsewhere." The truth was more terrifying than the Korthaks could have imagined. The Terran war machine had never truly been disbanded. It had simply been dispersed. Veterans had been scattered across the galaxy, living quiet lives but maintaining contact through networks that existed outside official channels. They had been a weapon held in reserve, waiting for the day when humanity would need them again. That day had come. On the Remembrance, Captain Chen watched the tactical displays as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The response to Protocol 7 had exceeded even her expectations. Ships that had been thought destroyed were emerging from hidden bases. Weapons that had been classified as experimental were being deployed, and veterans who had been presumed dead were revealing themselves to be very much alive. Admiral Reed is taking command of the Third Fleet, reported Lieutenant Webb, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and anticipation. General Morrison is mobilizing the Outer Rim Defense Force, and Colonel Jong is requesting permission to deploy the Phantom Division. Chen nodded grimly. The Phantom Division, soldiers who had been officially declared dead but had continued to operate in the deepest black ops imaginable. If they were being deployed, it meant the Terran war machine were preparing for total war. "What about the Korthek Empire?" she asked. "They are mobilizing their entire fleet," Webb replied. "Intelligence suggests they are planning a preemptive strike against human space." Chen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Let them come. They wanted to see what humans were capable of. Now they'll learn why we were never allowed to truly retire. The message went out across the galaxy, carried by networks that the Korthax didn't even know existed. The veterans of the Terran war machine were returning to duty, and they were bringing with them decades of accumulated knowledge, refined tactics, and weapons that most civilizations could only dream of. The Korthek Empire had attacked a single ship carrying 30 elderly humans. In response, they had awakened something that had been sleeping for 20 years, the full might of humanity's military machine, operated by people who had spent their entire lives learning to fight. The war that was about to begin would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Battle of Kepler's Nebula would be remembered as the day the Korthak Empire learned the true meaning of human warfare. Their fleet, massive and confident, emerged from hyperspace to find what appeared to be a modest human defensive formation, fewer than 200 ships facing their armada of over 1,000 vessels. Supreme Commander Vactoral studied the tactical display with satisfaction. The humans had responded to his mobilization exactly as predicted, gathering their forces in a defensive posture that would allow him to destroy their fleet in a single, decisive engagement. "All ships, advance to attack formation," he ordered. "We will show the galaxy what happens to those who challenge the Korthak Empire." The first indication that something was wrong came when the human ships began to move. They didn't retreat or attempt to form a traditional battle line. Instead, they scattered in patterns that seemed random but felt somehow deliberate. Vactoral had seen enough battles to recognize the difference between chaos and choreography. "So," reported his tactical officer, "the human ships they're not following standard engagement protocols." Vactoral's mandibles clicked nervously. "What are they doing?" "I don't know, sir, but they are moving like they know something we don't." They did. The veterans of the Terran war machine had spent decades fighting enemies across the galaxy, learning from each engagement, refining their tactics, and developing strategies that existed nowhere in official doctrine. They had faced threats that made the Korthak Empire look like a minor irritation, and they had won. Admiral Reed, commanding from the bridge of the Retribution, watched the Korthak fleet advance with the calm satisfaction of someone who had seen this play out many times before. The enemy was thinking in terms of traditional fleet engagements, massive formations clashing in the void. They weren't prepared for what was about to happen. "All units, execute Phoenix Protocol," he ordered. The human ship suddenly accelerated, not toward the Korthak fleet but around it, using the nebula's unique properties to mask their movements. What had appeared to be a retreat was actually the opening move in a tactical demonstration that would redefine space warfare. The Korthaks found themselves surrounded, but not in the way they expected. The human ships weren't forming a traditional encirclement. They were creating a three-dimensional maze of overlapping fields of fire, using the nebula's gas clouds and electromagnetic disturbances to create kill zones that were invisible until it was too late. "This is impossible," Vactoral muttered, watching his tactical display show ship after ship disappearing into the nebula's depths. "They're outnumbered 5-1. "So," his tactical officer replied, his voice tight with fear, "I don't think numbers matter to them." The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than the Korthax could comprehend. The veterans of the Terran war machine weren't fighting a battle. They were conducting a clinical demonstration of what happened when a civilization that had spent centuries perfecting the art of war decided to stop holding back. Captain Chen, aboard the Remembrance, coordinated the assault with the precision of someone who had commanded fleets through the darkest days of the Terran War. The ship that had started this conflict was now serving as a command vessel, its elderly crew directing a battle that would determine the fate of civilizations. Phantom Division is in position, reported Commander Vasquez. The Korthax command ship is isolated. Chen nodded. The Phantom Division, soldiers who had been officially declared dead but had continued to operate in the deepest black ops imaginable, were about to demonstrate why they had been kept in reserve for 20 years. The Korthax command ship never saw the attack coming. One moment it was coordinating the fleet's defense. The next it was being boarded by soldiers who moved like ghosts and fought like demons. Supreme Commander Vactoral found himself facing humans who had spent decades learning to fight in environments that would kill ordinary soldiers. "Surrender," said Colonel Zhang, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had captured enemy commanders on a dozen worlds. "Your fleet is destroyed. Your empire is about to learn what happens when you attack people who have spent their lives protecting others." Vactoral looked around the bridge of his flagship, seeing his crew overwhelmed by soldiers who had seemed to appear from nowhere. "You're just humans," he said desperately. "You're not supposed to be this effective." Zhang's smile was cold. "We're not just humans. We're the reason why other civilizations sleep peacefully at night. We're the people who fight the wars that others can't even imagine. And you made the mistake of waking us up." The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Korthax Empire's fleet had ceased to exist. Not destroyed, erased. The humans had demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that made every other military force in the galaxy suddenly reconsider their own capabilities. News of the battle spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, carried by networks that most civilizations didn't even know existed. The message was simple and terrifying. The humans had been holding back for decades, and now they weren't. On the Remembrance, Captain Chen stood in the observation deck, looking out at the stars where the Korthax fleet had once been. Around her, the veterans of the Terran war machine were beginning to stand down, their brief return to duty coming to an end. "What happens now?" asked Dr. Harrison. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Now we go back to our gardens and our books and our quiet lives. But the galaxy will remember what happened here. They'll remember that some people are too dangerous to attack, even when they are trying to retire." The Korthax Empire would survive, but as a shadow of its former self. The attack on the Remembrance had triggered a response that had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. Other civilizations would think twice before threatening human space, knowing that somewhere in the void, the veterans of the Terran war machine were waiting. The war was over, but its lesson would endure. Never attack people who have spent their lives learning to fight, especially when they are trying to enjoy their retirement. Some fires never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to burn again.